Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Halifax International Security Forum in Nova Scotia, Canada, one of the world's leading gatherings of military, diplomatic, economic, civil society leaders. Our coverage here on this 10th anniversary version of this great forum is sponsored by L3 Technologies and Leonardo DRS. And we're going to talk to Daryl Bricker, the CEO of Ipsos, the world's leading public polling as well as marketing firm, and certainly one of the more thoughtful and interesting people here every single year, Daryl. There are things that you mentioned just in passing that end up really being tectonic. You guys also do the signature poll that's issued at the start of each one of these forums on international trends and thinking on security. Talk to us a little bit about what this year's results are.
Well, the world's worried. I mean, we think that it's a dangerous place. Now, interestingly, we think it's a little bit less dangerous than we thought last year, which I think is probably a reflection of people turning more to domestic issues and being more concerned about those than they are about international issues right now. But the thing about international polling that we're discovering after 8 years with the forum is that some of these international trends tend to have an endurance beyond what we see, for example, in public opinion numbers at the domestic level. So some of the things that we're seeing are really pretty representative of what the world thinks about many issues.
And how do this year's results shape up from last year's results or prior year results, right? I mean, you're into trend analysis is one of the other things, all right? Not just spot checking it, but looking at the trend. How does the trend compare to what we've been seeing?
We remain pessimists, but a little less pessimistic than we were last year. Most of the world, taking a look at international issues, aren't as concerned as they were last year. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily believe that the world is on the right track. 60% of the people that we interview around the world think that the world's actually on the wrong track. So maybe a little less pessimistic than they were, but still nonetheless pessimistic.
One of the leading results, I think, from last year's poll was, very strong global engagement, right? We need to invest in this capability. It's very, very important for peace and stability. We talked a little bit that may have been an aftermath or a whiplash from the 2016 election in the United States. Does that trend continue in terms of strong support for an investment in defense, national security, and stability? Well,
yeah, it's always a bit of a sort of a bifurcated response. People do generally think that their domestic economy needs to have more attention, but at the same time in their brains, they do believe that they need to lead in the world. And the two of the countries that really feel that among the strongest of the 26 nations that we looked at are the United States and Canada. So yes, they believe there needs to be a domestic focus, but they also believe that their government should be engaged in the world. And we haven't seen those trends diminish.
I want to take you to your book on demography that's coming out. It's titled
Empty Planet: The Shock of Global Population Decline.
And it's coming out in February, if I recall.
Yeah, February 5th. It'll be out basically around the world on February the 5th in the United States with Crown Publishing.
It's your third serious book, but your sixth overall book.
Yeah, I just can't stop.
Well, so as a fan of demography, you led a fascinating conversation. One of the things about this great forum is you have the big events, you have the plenary discussions, but then there are really these intimate, fascinating small group dinners that there's a bit of chance involved which one you end up at. But we were talking about demography last night, and there are things that people say as fact, right? The global population is going to be at 11 billion and we won't be able to sustain it, or birth rates are high in this part of the world or that. And talk to us about all of the things that people say that are actually completely wrong when it comes to demography and what tracks we're on, and why or what has to happen for public policy to catch up with actual fact-based decision-making as opposed to emotional decision-making?
Well, the interesting thing in the world of demography is people, I think, are making facts into political statements these days. So yeah, you really have to take a look at those facts and look at whether they really have any scientific basis. Now, the UN tells us that the world's going to reach 11.2 billion people by the year 2100, which, we're at 7.5 billion people right now. That's a pretty major increase in the global population. But when you really sit down and take a look at it, it's pretty hard to see how we get to 11.2 billion people, because basically what's happened in the world is fertility rates, birth rates have collapsed. So more likely we're going to end up somewhere between about 8 and 9 billion people by mid-century, and then it's going to start to decline after that. And then really the only question is how fast. Now, the interesting thing between the UN and what I'm saying is not necessarily what the trend is going to be. The UN agrees that something like that is going to happen. I just happen to think it's going to happen faster, and I'm not alone. There's a number of demographers that actually believe that.
And when you say there's going to be a decline, and you said how fast, but your estimation is it declines very quickly, which could cause problems of its own.
Yeah, there's some possibility that it will decline very quickly because the human life does have an end date, and we're going to have a whole huge bulge of global population that's going to be in that age group mid-century and later, and particularly in the developing world, which, by the way, isn't rich enough in many instances to be able to, developing world isn't rich enough to support the level of elderly population that they're going to have. So in those places, people aren't going to be living as long, but they're still going to be living longer than their parents did, and there's going to be a potential for a very significant die-off and the population to collapse as a result.
Talk to us about the three major trends you see shaping demography, right? So you were talking about fertility rates, but we're also talking about how many children people are having. And so even though people repeat like, oh, in Africa this is a problem, or in the Middle East, all of these dynamics all around the world, in part because of rising prosperity, but other factors are changing. Talk to us about the factors that are driving some of these changes.
Well, there isn't a significant country in the world that's experienced an increase in birth rates for the last 50 years. So the idea that we're expanding the number of children being born in the world is simply not true. If you take a look at the top 10 most populous countries in the world, since 1960 they've lost half of their fertility. The average number of kids, for example, born in a place like China these days is probably somewhere around 1.5. It might be even lower. In India, it's about 2.4. The UN tells us, maybe lower, maybe closer to about 2.1. That's 35% of the world's population. And they're basically at replacement rate or below in terms of the number of kids that they're producing. Yes, you could point to Africa, but even in Africa, where birth rates remain stubbornly high, I would say in some countries, even there the birth rates are declining. The question is, how fast is it going to occur? All of this adds up into a situation in which you look for that pocket that's going to create great fertility, that's going to, say, for example, offset the huge population declines we're experiencing in Asia, and we're also experiencing in Europe now, and there isn't a pocket. Maybe it's on Mars, but it's not here on Earth.
And talk to us a little bit about China, because there's this perception that, they're on track, and at this rate they'll be at 1.6 billion, but that's not the case. Well, there's a one-child policy that's been in effect that was only recently rescinded, or I should say an official policy that was rescinded. What does China's trends do? Because the concern is that the country will get old before it gets rich, and therefore, you need young people to be feeding this base to support older people for healthcare and a whole bunch of other things. Talk to us a little bit about the Chinese demographic, which a lot of American strategists are constantly focused on.
Well, depending on the estimates you want to accept, the Chinese population is going to decline somewhere between 300 and 500 million people before the end of the century. That's a huge decline in population. If you accept the more extreme level of that, by the end of the century, the U.S. population, which is still increasing, by the way, may be roughly similar to what the Chinese population is. That's how big a decline China is going to experience. And the reason for that is their birth rate is almost non-existent, even though they got rid of the one-child policy a couple of years ago. But also the shape of the population has changed. So in 1950, the average Chinese person lived to the age of 40. Today, they live somewhere in their late 70s into their early 80s. That means that most of the population growth that's happening in China right now, the remaining population growth, is coming as a result of people aging, not because a lot of kids are being born. And of course, the problem with that is after the age of about 45, very difficult for women to have children without big medical intervention. So a growing population that's elderly, a shrinking population that's younger, that's a population that's in a position where it could collapse.
Now, what are the tensions that puts, right? I mean, societally, talk to us about the Coachella example, because I think that was utterly fascinating and a sort of a tectonic shift that most people actually may not even be paying attention to. So give us the example and what it tells us.
Well, we have a marketplace that's obsessed with youth, and that's probably a really good thing since the end of the Second World War, because most of the growth that we saw in our population came from kids. So the whole marketplace was about supplying the parents of those kids with what the kids needed. So we have an obsession in marketing and advertising with youth. We feature it everywhere. But the truth is, young people really don't have a lot of money these days for a whole lot of reasons we can get into. It's actually the older population that has all the money. So the most profitable music concert series in the world is Coachella, which takes place outside of Los Angeles. One of those stand in the field things, kind of like Woodstock, where everybody shows up and they have a great experience. Top ticket there a few years ago was about $900 to spend a couple of weekends to watch bands. Hugely profitable event. Until the next year they held another event called Desert Trip, which a lot of people jokingly called Old Chella, in which the ticket price was twice as much and they made twice as much money. And the reason was because the average age of the acts was about 72. The average age of the people who attended was in their 50s. What's the difference? Well, you can charge a lot more because older people have money. You just have to make the event comfortable for them. So they had numbered seats, they had good wine, they had good food, they had washrooms that worked, all those things that you need for older people to feel comfortable participating in that kind of an event. And what they succeeded in doing is unlocking money that people probably would have sat on or spent in another way on something like music, a concert event. Rather than targeting it to youth, they target it to that audience, and we're very successful as a result of doing it.
But societally, as younger people, right, are engaged in the gig economy, they come out of college with a lot of debt, they move back home until their 30s. What are some of the dynamics? They have the best homes, right? I mean, you mentioned that a lot of this economy it's the older people who've got the money. What are some of the policy changes? And then when it comes to aging and replenishment and tax bases, right? I mean, these kids are not making as much money now that their preceding generations would have been making, right? So they're not feeding into the fund either, right? I mean, so this is the tyranny of demography or statistics, right? It eventually catches up with you. What are some of the public policy changes that societies have to consider as these populations live longer for a whole variety of factors?
Well, one of the big issues that they're going to have to deal with is mobility, because old populations aren't necessarily as mobile as young populations. And all of this population, the biggest migration that's happening in the world today is people leaving the countryside and moving to the city. Back in 1960, about a third of us lived in a city. The UN tells us it's going to be about 68% by 2050 are going to be living in cities. So there's this huge collapse of population moving into cities. Another factor that creates lower birth rates. But what happens in those cities is people do live longer. If you want to live longer, don't live in the country, actually live in the city where healthcare services are available and longevity tends to be expanded. The problem with that is that older population isn't retiring in the way that it used to, isn't selling their homes in the way that they used to. They're aging in place, they're staying right where they are. So all those younger people who are now coming up and looking for that home in the city, because they now have to live there, looking for the opportunity to break into careers where those older people are living longer and healthier. What we've created is a whole generation that's not able to start the way that their parents did and their grandparents did with their adult lives. So in a city like Toronto, where I live, 50% of the people who are 30 years of age or under still live at home with their parents. So in terms of public policy, these are obviously some very interesting challenges that we're not spending a lot of time talking about right now.
And that's right, and if you're going to do guaranteeing minimum wages or minimum incomes, that then has impact on whatever resources may be available for national security, for example, right? So because it's all in one conjoined ecosystem. There's a lot of discussion about migration and refugees, and certain political leaders around the world have used that to fan their own bases to drive their own policies and views regarding ethnic purity, for example, and a whole bunch of other things. What's the reality about migration and immigration?
Well, the reality is the numbers aren't as big as we think they are. I mean, so we're told that there's a sort of catastrophe of people moving all over the world, all of this immigration happening. Not really. Only about 3% of the world's population today doesn't live in the country in which it was born. And that includes people who are legitimate immigrants, that includes people who are undocumented or whatever you want to say. People who are still alive today who live in a country that is not the country they were born in is about 3% of the world's population. The percentage of refugees is less than 1%. And even smaller when you take out people who are sort of internal refugees within their own country, or people, say, for example, in the Palestinian situation. If you look at the people, say, for example, that are coming out of places like Syria or Afghanistan or Africa as a result being displaced by war, violence, that kind of thing, it's not as big a number as we claim that it is. Nonetheless, that's where a lot of the focus seems to be. There are other examples. For example, like in the United States, it's really a question of Latin American immigration that's really a big question. But when we look at this phenomena of people moving, the truth is, in most of the countries that they're moving to, particularly in places like Europe, really do have a population problem. aging populations, really low birth rates, very expensive social programs. Somebody's going to have to pay for that. But unfortunately, what you see in Europe right now are countries, say for example like Hungary, that would rather go old and get a lot poorer rather than accept new people coming into that country. So they're going to have to somehow square all of these circles, and part of that squaring of the circles is going to either have to be an internal increase in birth rates, which very few countries have succeeded at. In fact, I can't really name any, or finding a way like Canada has, the place that we are today, where they can absorb a significant amount of immigration, settle it effectively, and help continue to grow the population and reduce the impact of population aging.
From a U.S. demographic trend standpoint, it was interesting that we're actually one of the countries that the population is actually increasing on a regular basis.
Well, it's increasing for basically two reasons, because it's not because of birth, because the U.S. has a below replacement rate population too. It's about 1.9. The reason the American population continues to increase is because the population continues to age, and longevity is increasing, although there are certain segments of the population where that is a problem, and I think the opioids crisis and other things have had some effects on that. But the other thing is, like it or not, the United States still brings in about 1 million immigrants a year. So, and whenever we go out and ask surveys on which country, if you had to move away from your country and immigrate to another one, people say on surveys, they tell us it still is the United States. So it still is that shining beacon on the horizon for a lot of people around the world. So one of the successes of the United States is it's been able to deal with this process of continuing to grow through immigration. The problem that we find ourselves in now politically in the United States is throwing up walls and stopping that process is going to create the similar types of problems in the United States that we're experiencing in other places if they can't solve it. Because the only other choice is to increase birth rates, which is very unlikely to happen.
What are going to be the impacts? Where there was always a lot of concern about the impact of additive manufacturing, increased automation, right? Trucks get taken off the roads, electric cars, unemployed mechanics. There could be very tectonic changes, right? Manufacturing more, the United States is manufacturing more than it ever has, but the proportion of manufacturing jobs are fewer than there would be, right? I mean, more people are manufacturing, but they're leveraging technology. At a time when your population, you have these youth trends, you have some of these demographic trends, how is that fundamental change that's impending, whether over the next 10 or 20 years, going to affect societies as a whole? I mean, does that factor into the demographic thing? I mean, how does that affect the model from your standpoint?
Well, it's compensatory, right? I mean, it's a way that you deal with the fact that you can't find workers. I mean, if you don't have a youthful population, maybe robots. But the problem with robots and AI and everything else that we want to point to is robots don't buy groceries. Robots don't buy cars. Robots don't, the consumer economy is not generated by robots. So what we're going to have to do is look at some other forms of generating wealth to be able to pay for all the programs that this older group of the population is going to be requiring. Because the thing about both older populations and very young populations is they're expensive populations. Older populations because healthcare, pensions, all sorts of things that are associated with the process of aging, all of these people moving to cities that are going to have to reboot their infrastructure in order to be able to accommodate their mobility issues, very, very expensive population. So how are we going to pay for that? And usually it's through some form of consumer tax, various types of income taxes and other things. Well, we're not going to have as many people working. We're not going to be having people consuming as much unless we find a way of unlocking that wealth. We're going to continue to see these people very, very active in the political process. One thing that we know about older people, and you certainly know in the United States, is they vote. A lot of issues we're going to have to deal with that are really generated by demographic trends. I actually look at all these technological and economic trends as simply responses to what's happening demographically.
It's positively extraordinary. Let me, and the last question, bring it around to the survey. One of the things you also look at is how the international community looks at countries all around the world in terms of whether they see them as leaders or not. A lot of debate here about whether the United States as sort of the brand has been tarnished. A lot of discussion on that. From your perspective, what did you find?
Well, yeah, it has come down. I think it's down about 15 points. And the truth is the United States is kind of in the middle of the pack now, interestingly with China and with India. But where you sit is where you stand. I mean, so for example, Israel support for the United States is off the charts. But if you go to a place like Argentina, not so much. So the United States certainly retains some credibility and some leadership potential in significant parts of the world, but obviously the last 2 years hasn't had a positive impact on the reputation.
Darrell Bricker, the CEO of Ipsos, one of the world's leading public affairs polling and marketing companies, and congratulations on the new book, which is?
It's called Empty Planet, written with John Ebbetson. It'll be out on February 5th.
Fantastic. Best of luck on the book, and looking forward to talking to you about this important topic. Absolutely fascinating as always, Darrell. You're one of the real value adds of a very value add conference.
You're too kind. Thank you very much.